Violent criminal gangs are nothing new in South Africa, but lately, the townships have seen a surge in organized crime groups terrorizing communities, engaging in extortions, robberies, dope dealing, and cold-blooded hits. There was a time in Tembisa where treacherous gangs ruled the streets with an iron fist. By 6 o'clock each evening, we'd be barricaded inside our homes, doors locked while a symphony of gunfire erupted outside. It felt like a war zone with comrades and gangsters violently clashing it out on the streets of the East Rand. Now, in the tense lead up to the 1994 elections, Tembisa was captured by gangsterism. One of the most notorious gangs to emerge during this period was the Toasters gang, led by a ruthless street warlord known as Aster. Their base, located in Umtambega section, was a no-go zone for anyone not aligned with their cause. The gang formed around 1990, and between then and mid-1992, the Toasters gang was alleged to have killed around 15 people in Umtambega. They were notorious for jack-rolling schoolgirls, robbing anything with the pulse. The residents of Tembisa were so terrified that people stopped going to Shebeens when the gang's terror tactics had become legendary. Now, the Toasters gang was later linked to the Inkatha Freedom Party, the IFP, based in Vosmoze Hostel. Whenever the community sought retribution, the gang would flee back to the safety of the hostel, and at the time, political tensions were very high, with the predominantly ANC supporting community of Tembisa clashing with the Inkatha affiliated Hostel Dwellers. On the 1st of August in 1993, there was a massacre in Tembisa. Around 200 Zulus of Inkatha, killing at least 30 people at random, and many people were injured. They were armed with AK-47s, shotguns, pistols, spears, pangas, nopkiris, anything that would hurt you. And they unleashed a wave of terror, burning houses with petrol bombs, setting cars alight. You see, residents quickly formed armed defense units to retaliate. Now, these tensions were part of a broader strategy to disrupt the upcoming 1994 democratic elections. Now, in this episode, we'll delve into the treacherous history of Tembisa's most notorious gang, the Toasters, and the political violence between the hostel dwellers and the broader community. Now, this is a story of a conflict that claimed the lives of many men in those turbulent times. Before Tembisa, in the 1930s, there were settlements such as Dindela near Edenvale, Pelindaba in the Isando Spartan area, Mooifontein and Diki Line. Now, when the National Party came to power in 1948 and implemented apartheid policies, black people were forcefully removed from these white areas and relocated to the newly established Tembisa in the early 1950s. Now, neighborhoods or sections within Tembisa were divided according to the tribes or languages people spoke. Zulus and other Nguni speakers in one area, Sothos, Pedis and Tswanas in another, Tsongas, vendors in separate section. Now, over time, these areas became more mixed, but residents were often separated by sections they lived in, and at times by their political affiliations.
This hostel is called the Setoga Hostel. It was the first hostel in Tembisa. This hostel is called the stronghold of the ANC. Most of the people who used to be IFP supporters were driven out of this hostel, and they went to Vosimoze Hostel.
In the late 1980s and especially in the early 90s, gang violence was prevalent, with gangs often fighting based on the sections they were from. Gunfights would break out in broad daylight between neighboring areas, but the violence intensified after 6 p.m. when the Apollo lights came on and the heavy weaponry was brought out. Politics was always at the center of this violence. When many comrades returned from exile, they faced challenges as they often lacked opportunities afforded to those in leadership positions. Frustration grew as these individuals tried to reintegrate into society, often returning to their old political structures. Now, within the ANC branches in townships, divisions and infightings were common, leading to the emergence of a phenomenon known as comrade tsotsis or komtsotsi. Now, these individuals, using their military skills they acquired in the MK or exile, turned to crime, engaging in activities such as robbing cash in transit vehicles, banks, businesses, and running ruthless criminal syndicates. The Toasters gang were initially affiliated with the ANC as comrades on the ground, but over time they became notorious gangsters and were eventually expelled from the organization. Initially, they were known for their involvement in car hijacking syndicates and robberies. However, after their departure from the ANC, they made enemies with some members within the party, leading to intense and violent conflicts. To demonstrate their ruthlessness, the Toasters retaliated not only against their direct enemies, but also against anyone connected to them, including mothers, kids, grannies. No one was safe. Now, at the height of their reign of terror, neighborhoods like Mtambega, Ntshonalanga, Ndayeni, Mfianeng became no-go zones for outsiders. Now, the war was real and these areas were considered extremely dangerous. Now, between 90 and mid-92, the Toasters were responsible for around 15 murders. The Toasters would frequent places like Zniko, Shibines, Stockfells, causing havoc wherever they went. They would hold people hostage, rob them of their belongings, and force women to wash their coochies in large bowls filled with hard liquor. The men were then forced to drink the liquor from these bowls or face being butchered like pigs. They earned their name the Toasters because they would toast their victims, a reference to the horrifying acts they committed. As kids, we had countless terrifying stories about these guys, many of which are too gruesome to even repeat. Now, one thing was certain, they had the entire neighborhood shook, living in fear. Now, the police were no help, as police before 94, they really intervened in township gang violence. Sometimes they would even use these gangsters for their own purposes. Now, the police were only concerned with politically affiliated activists. In response, comrades, street committees, and the community banded together to stand against this ruthless gang. Now, the community began actively hunting down the Toasters, intending to kill and toast them in return. Now, one night, the gang went to a shebeen to rob and terrorize as they usually do, unaware that comrades were nearby searching for them. Now, when the Toasters began their rampage, the people fought back and the gang fled. They chased them. But one member of the gang was not so lucky. He was captured by the mob and killed on the spot. After this event, the dynamics shifted dramatically. The once feared gangsters became the hunted. They eventually sought refuge in the Vusmuzi hostel, where the members of Inkatha resided, and it was the only place in the neighborhood where they were safe.
This hostel, on the other side of town, housed a gang called the Toasters. They were young IFP members who got out of hand. Their political and criminal activities included murder, rape, assault and robbery. The Toasters left a trail of destruction behind them. Their signature: burnt houses, property and people.
Whenever they would find a comrade, they would take you in their car and then they would kill you and then they would burn you. They took this child and put him inside hot oil, and that's where the name originates from.
The Toasters terrorized the community. They had a predictable route from the hostel down the hill, past a filling station where they entered ANC area. On the 1st of April 1992, one of their victims was Lefina Dlamini.
Inkatha and the Toasters came from the other side. They were carrying guns to attack people here in the township. They started shooting people out there in the streets until they entered my home here.
His friend Tommy, who was standing next to the window, was shot but escaped death by hiding underneath a table. His mother, Lefina, entered the room, not knowing that an attacker was waiting by the window and that his next shot would be fatal.
Conflicts erupted in the townships in the early 90s, reflecting the deep divisions that had emerged across the country. These conflicts included violent clashes between hostel residents and township communities. Now, criminal gangs played a central role in the violence, quickly becoming embroiled in the broader struggle for power during the height of political competition. Now, these gangs exploited the divisions between Inkatha and the local community to their advantage. In the early 90s, Inkatha Freedom Party launched an aggressive recruitment campaign in township hostels. Now, before this, relationships between hostel dwellers and township residents had been relatively okay. However, this changed after Feb 1990, when some Zulu residents of the townships began joining the newly unbanned IFP party. Plus, they were joined by other members who came from KZN to come work in the Gauteng province. IFP members were viewed as enemies or rivals by ANC supporters, leading to intense political conflict. Now, many IFP supporters were eventually driven out of the community, seeking refuge in hostels where they found safety in numbers. Now, in Tembisa, for example, Inkatha members were violently expelled from the community and forced into Vusmuzi hostel. Similarly, in other hostels like Sethucha in the hood, which was predominantly ANC. Now, the Inkatha supporters were also driven out of that hostel as well to Vusmuzi hostel, so it was crazy times. So now, in addition to the ongoing battles between gangsters and the community, another brutal conflict raged between Inkatha hostel dwellers and the township residents. Now, the area became a war zone. You know, growing up in such a dangerous environment, we never imagined that peace could ever be possible amidst the atmosphere of intolerance and hatred between the township residents and the Zulus in Vusmuzi, plus the gangsters. As someone in the media openly stated, all it took to ignite a war in the eastern townships was 2 bullets, one fired at the hostel and another at the residents' homes. And you've got a perfect concoction for a violent storm. While using the hostel as their base and for protection, the Toasters continued their criminal activities, attacking their ops, including local ANC leaders and comrades. As long as they confined their activities to the township, the hostel residents tolerated the presence of the gang, even though some hostel residents met with local leaders to resolve the problem. They explained that they could not evict members of the gang because they had protection from certain high-ranking leaders. Now, it was also known that the Toasters gang used to get their guns from the hostels. As the community's anger and frustration with the gang worsened, more members of the gang were hunted down day and night by comrades and people seeking revenge. One day, a comrade by the name of Abel got into an accident while trying to escape from the gang, and he crashed into a neighbor's precast wall. When the members of the gang came for him, he apparently tried to run away, but they caught up with him, and the first shot hit him in the forehead, and he was later finished off with multiple bullets fired from all sides. During Abel's funeral, as comrades were paying their last respects, shots were fired and people fell with bullet wounds. The attackers were firing from trees around the cemetery. The shooting was so intense that people fled, leaving the grave uncovered. The gunfire continued for a while, and police in Caspers or hippos did nothing to stop the shooting. The gang also attempted to kill his son Sipho, but they failed. Thokozulu, the mother of a member of the Toasters gang, told the TRC Commission that on the 9th of May 1992, ANC comrades came to a home looking for her son Peter. Now, Peter had allegedly killed one of the comrades' family members and relatives. Now, when they did not find him, they only found Peter's grandmother. Now, the grandmother was shot and killed. They chopped off her legs and they burned her right then. They petrol bombed the home, completely destroying it. Now, the same comrades in 1993 caught up with Peter, they shot him and they netlist him right then on the spot. On May the 1st, 1993, the gang leader Esther was shot dead by allegedly a hostel resident. It's unclear, but there's reports that police might have removed his body from the crime scene before the comrades arrived to prevent them from burning his corpse. Now mourners returning from his funeral were fired upon, and they retaliated by shooting back at the ANC members, and it became another gunfight. In what appeared to be an act of revenge, Esther's body was exhumed or dug out from Mfihlweni Cemetery and taken to Endayeni taxi rank about 5 kilometers away, where it was set alight. Now this incident sparked further violence, resulting in deaths of numerous people. Now Esther's death marked the end of the Toasters gang's dominance in Tembisa, as the gang quickly disintegrated without its leader. Now the killing of Esther was perceived by some as vigilante justice or retribution for the terror he had inflicted on the community. Now others saw it as part of a broader effort to purge criminal elements that had been exploited during the political violence of the time.
The leader of the Toasters was called Esther. He was killed, but after the funeral, the community decided to strike back.
I just heard that his body has been exhumed and burned, and I was there. I went to go and watch, and I just told myself that at least they have revenged on our behalf.
Then Esther's brother took over as leader of the gang. He is now one of the members who are in prison and may apply for amnesty.
Esther's demise symbolized the violent cycle that engulfed many in the townships during South Africa's turbulent transition, where those who lived by the sword often met their end by it as well. Now tensions escalated further in the neighborhood, particularly in 1993, which was one of the most dangerous years to live in Tembisa or East Rand or even Gauteng in general. On the 1st of August 1993, around 200 Zulus of Inkatha rampaged through Tembisa, particularly in the areas of Vusmuzi, Welumlambo, Tafeni, Sivane, Spetweni, killing at least 30 people, and scores were injured at random using AKs, spears, pangas, nopkiris, anything that would cause you bodily harm. You see, people were murdered as they slept in their homes, pleading for their lives before being brutally hacked to death. Houses were torched with petrol bombs, cars were set ablaze. Now the ANC called for an immediate independent investigation into the eyewitness reports, where the police denied the fact that the attackers had been transported away from the scene using police Caspers or hippos.
During a spree of violence, residents who were not Zulu and not Inkatha members were driven out of the hostel. Victims of the terror came to tell the commission in Tembisa this week about a different type of forced removal.
These people wanted to know, is it a male or a female that you're carrying, the child? But before they could see that it's a boy. They pulled this child by the foot and they hit the child against the wall and she cracked her skull.
I found my brother. It was somewhere in the forest. There was nobody around. I looked at him and he was dead. I tried to turn him to see. I could see that all his bones were broken.
When all the ANC and Xhosa residents had left the hostel, Vuzimuzi turned its attention to the larger Tembisa community. More and more people started looking for their loved ones in mortuaries.
I found him at the mortuary. He was burnt. I recognized him by his foot, which was burnt, but it wasn't fully burnt.
What made me identify my husband was a piece of clothing under his arm, which was broken in half. His right hand was actually amputated. His legs were broken in half.
The massacre was intended to unleash tribal and racial wars and to prevent the negotiated transition to a democratic and non-racial society. Now, in the week leading up to the Tembisa massacre, about 90 people were killed in other East Rand townships in Johannesburg. Following this period of intense violence in the Eastern townships, South Africa's journey towards democracy continued to be filled with challenges despite escalating violence and deepening mistrust between communities. The early 90s also marked the beginning of significant political change. Eventually, intense negotiations and peace talks led to the establishment of a transitional government. Now, this culminated in South Africa's first democratic elections in 1994, where Nelson Mandela was elected as the country's first black president. Now, the end of apartheid and the beginning of a new democratic era did not immediately heal the wounds inflicted by years of violence, but it laid the foundation for reconciliation and nation building. Now, the legacy of violence in the East Rand and other areas remains a reminder of the painful path South Africa had to walk to achieve freedom. Tembisa is a different place now compared to what it once was. Though the events of the past have undeniably shaped its present, many children grew up without fathers, uncles or brothers. Mothers lost their sons and families were torn apart. Now, the trauma and memories of those times still linger in people's minds today. While Tembisa now faces new challenges and socio-economic issues, crime remains a big challenge and a big problem, as it does in many townships across South Africa. However, the most significant issue facing the young people of today is the drug epidemic, which is stifling their potential. But every generation has its own struggles that they must overcome sooner or later.
The female dog, igama layo Tembisa. Mawungisukela ngihamba nayo ngithi Tembisa. Ngiphume Tembisa, ngathi abungithembisa. Khole nge-fast cash, mangabe lost ngiyayichangeisa. Got the female dog, igama layo Tembisa. Mawungisukela ngihamba nayo ngithi Tembisa. Ngiphume Tembisa, ngathi abungithembisa. Khole nge-fast cash, mangabe lost ngiyayichangeisa. Ngiphethe papa nganaphila.